So today, fortunately, we have really an international expert here to talk about climate change ethics and the implementation of the Paris Climate Treaty with Donald Brown here. So Donald Brown is a scholar in residence and professor for sustainability ethics and law at Widener University, where he teaches international environmental law, human rights law, and climate change law. He was a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, and was previously a program manager for the United Nations organizations at EPA's International Environmental Policy Office, where he represented US EPA in negotiating sustainability issues at the United Nations, including climate change, international water issues, biodiversity, and Agenda 21. Mr. Brown has written extensively on climate change and sustainability issues and lectured on these matters in 35 countries. He authored the book, Navigating the Perfect Moral Storm, Climate Ethics, and has written over 160 books, book chapters, and articles on environmental and sustainability ethics and law. He holds a BS in Commerce and Engineering Sciences from Drexel University, a JD from Seton Hall University School of Law, and an MA in Liberal Studies majoring in Philosophy and Art from the New School University, where he was also in the PhD program in Philosophy. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Brown, and I look forward to his presentation.
Thanks. Sometimes you hear an introduction of yourself and you say, who is that person that they're talking about? Okay. It's good to see you all. Are most of the students enrolled in a climate course? Yes or no? No? Okay. I'm going to argue, you've heard a lot about climate change. I'm going to argue you can't think clearly about what to do about climate change until you see the ethical and moral issues. The policy depends upon you spotting the ethical and moral issues. When I talk about this with my students, they usually have 4 weeks of climate science before we get to this part of it, okay? And so I'm going to go real quickly through some of this stuff. Some of you, the science, you may not be able to follow exactly, but I think you'll get the gist of what I'm trying to say. For 25 years in the United States, the debate has been about what on climate change? It's been about two issues. In my view, the climate opponents have defined the problem, have resisted the problem by claiming two things. One is there's not enough scientific certainty. You've heard that. You hear that in the presidential debate. People actually amazingly calling it a hoax. And the other argument you hear is what? That it will destroy jobs, it will destroy the US economy. The environmental community has responded to that debate by accepting that framing. So the environmental community for 35 years, when the opponents of climate change have said there's not enough scientific uncertainty, they simply responded by saying everything is certain, or rather than talking about how 35 years ago, a lot of this was certain. And we also understood the longer you wait to solve the problem, the worse it would get. And so even the question of how much certainty you need depends upon what's at stake, who gets harmed, whether the problem gets worse, whether the victims have consented to waiting for 35 years to do anything. Even the scientific uncertainty issue is at base, in large part, an ethical and moral problem, not simply a scientific problem. And the economic argument, the way the environmental community has responded when the opponents of climate change say it will destroy jobs, is to say what? Oh, it will create jobs. Okay. So they've accepted the framing of the opponents of climate change. You can't really respond to the arguments of the opponents until you see the ethical and moral issues with climate change. So, I fault higher education for not teaching people about applied ethics to environmental problems. You can get a PhD from the Kennedy School in Environmental Policy, and you get no ethics training. You get only neoclassical economic theory, cost-benefit analysis, and things like that to talk about what you should do about climate change. So it is startling to me that the ethical dimensions of climate change are not front and center. When you go to the international negotiations, the justice issues are the issues. For 40 years, the victims of climate change have been screaming that the United States, stop doing what you're doing to us. This is a death sentence for us, okay? As you will see, the justice issues are the issues particularly when it starts to become too late to prevent serious warming. So, I'm going to dwell on this slide. I'm going to go through the other slides very, very quickly, but I'm going to stop a little slowly on this slide because there's some key ideas in this slide that you have to get to fully understand what I'm about to say. So the atmosphere is like a bathtub in that it has a limited volume. The lower ring on the bathtub is the atmospheric concentration, or how much greenhouse gases were in the atmosphere for about 11,000 years. We live in an interglacial period that is enormously stable. Okay, the temperatures have been unusually stable for about 11,000 years. If you go back before 11,000 years, you'll see that Earth's climate has jumped up and down rapidly. So for 11,000 years, the lower ring in the bathtub was stable at around 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide, 280 parts per million. Well, the Industrial Revolution gets started first in England, then largely in the United States, and people start through combustion of fossil fuels, mostly coal initially, later petroleum, and now natural gas. Combustion of fossil fuels, countries on the right-hand side start to pour greenhouse gases into the bathtub. So now the concentration is not 280 parts per million, which is responsible for a stable climate. It's already at 400 parts per million. Now, the upper ring in the bathtub is the level that we have to stabilize the atmospheric concentration at if we want to prevent really dangerous warming. So you can see that on the right, you can see different countries are putting different amounts of carbon into the atmospheric bathtub at different rates. The issue, the real issue in international negotiations is who gets to fill up the bathtub to the dangerous level, and what level should we decide is dangerous? Okay, both of those questions are not scientific questions. They're ethics questions. They're justice questions. At their core, they're ethics questions. The temperature limit is an ethical question because a country, in taking a position on its target, is taking a position on how much warming it's going to inflict upon other people. It's taking a position, whether it likes it or not, whether it's going to kill people from drought, deserts, rising seas, diseases, whether a country likes it or not, its target, the magnitude of the warming that its target is designed to achieve is at its core a moral question. It's not a scientific question. Now, policymakers haven't picked up on this either, and part of it is because they've been trained in sciences, in my view. I worked for both the federal government. I was Assistant Attorney General in Pennsylvania, and I was the first environmental lawyer in New Jersey. And the environmental agencies could go down the hall to their scientists to figure out what the legal environmental target would be. Almost all environmental problems, you don't have to think about these kinds of ethical questions. But setting a standard for climate change is amazingly, at its core, an ethical question, not a scientific question. And whether you like it or not, the US target or the Pennsylvania target is a position on ethical questions. I think you'll understand that even more as we go forward. There are features of climate change that shout for attention to see it as a moral and ethical question. That is, these features are not true of any other, or hardly any other, environmental problem. One, it's a problem caused by some people, mostly by high-emitting countries, mostly developing countries. They're inflicting harms on other places of the world. The disaggregation between who's causing the problem and who are the victims of the problems is startling. There's an almost complete separation. The victims of the problems, the most vulnerable people around the world, and therefore the people we here in the United States are hurting, are not Americans. We only talk about climate impacts to America, completely leaving off the table, we're killing people in Africa and other parts of the world. Africa is a basket case for climate impacts. The Sahel in Africa, right below the Sahara Desert, all the models say it's going to get drier, and we're going to create refugees, leading drought. Africa gets really hit hard by climate. Small island developing states, there are thousands of islands, particularly in the Pacific, where they only have 3 or 4 feet of sea level rise and the whole country's underwater. For 30 years, I've been going to the climate negotiations since they started. The small island developing states have been screaming at the US, don't do this to us. This is a death sentence. There are places like Kiribati and the Marshall Islands that are incredibly vulnerable to climate change, and we're causing the problem, okay? Southeast Asia, the Brahmaputra and Ganges are both glacier-fled streams. If the glaciers disappear, there's very little water for agriculture or for drinking water, okay? But it's us and the bigger countries that are causing the water problems. Why aren't we talking about justice when we talk about climate policy? And we're not talking about justice. What's going on here? How can you explain that? Okay. Another feature, the harms to the victims are not mere inconveniences, they're catastrophic. Their loss of life, their loss of water supply, their diseases, So the harms that we're inflicting on others are not inconveniences that you can deal with a cost-benefit analysis, okay? They're basic human rights. Why aren't we talking about ethics and justice? And the third feature of climate change that is unlike any other environmental problem that I'm aware of is the victims can't do anything to protect themselves. They can't petition their government, say pass a law in our government. Their best hope is that the people causing the problem will stop doing to them what is putting them at great risk. So amazingly, climate change is a civilization-challenging moral and ethical question, and yet we're not talking about it in that way, in those terms. Now, this chart, I'll go quickly. The science, if you had any climate science, you'd recognize that saw-like line in the middle of the chart. It's atmospheric concentrations of carbon as measured at Mauna Loa, Hawaii. They've been going up steadily. The Mauna Loa, I believe, was 1958 when they first started to measure it. That's the atmospheric concentration. On the left-hand side are the major scientific reports about how dangerous climate change was. So in 1978, the US Academy of Sciences said this is a serious, very serious threat. There's something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They've issued 5 reports. Every time a report is issued, the scientists saying this evidence is stronger and stronger. You hear presidents say there's no evidence that this is human-caused. I was sitting at a microphone representing the United States at 2 o'clock in the morning in 1997 when we were debating with all the countries in the world whether the evidence of human causation, this is human caused, not natural variability. You know, climates always change, but how do you know that it's human caused, not natural variability? The evidence is overwhelming that this is not what drives. The things that drive the natural variability are 4 Earth-Sun relationships, occasionally volcanoes, tectonic plates when they move, and ocean circulation. But the evidence of human causation is, and the whole world agreed. I was sitting at the microphone, and even the Saudis and the Iraqis who opposed everything, they agreed 20 years ago that the evidence of human causation is overwhelming. And they, at that meeting, for the first time, the whole world agreed that it was human-caused. Okay, not natural ability, but you have people saying that there's no evidence of human causation. Climate change just doesn't raise one ethical issue, it raises a host of policy issues. It raises the question of how much warming should it be okay for us to inflict upon the Africans or Southeast Asian. It raises questions about what our fair share is of global emissions. And by the way, going back to the bathtub, the differences between where we are now and the line at which we try to stabilize greenhouse gases is a good pictorial representation of something called a carbon budget. For different temperature regimes, the total number of gigatons, billions of tons of carbon that can be emitted that will make the atmospheric concentration raised in the bathtub to the level you want to stop it at can be calculated pretty simply. There's some uncertainty, so they usually calculate it with probability statements associated with it. That's called the carbon budget. The carbon budget is how much is left for the whole world to divide up among itself to stabilize the atmospheric concentrations of carbon to prevent dangerous warming. Okay, so that's an ethical issue. It's not a scientific issue. Science alone can't tell you what to do. You got to figure out what distributive justice requires of countries, or what this is debated in the international community under the term equity. Who should pay for adaptation? Who should pay for the damages? That's an ethical question. There's law on that, and the law says, by the way, that those that caused the problem should pay for the damages. Ethics and morality would require that. There are some issues about how you interpret when that should start, but it's not controversial. There's a principle. I teach international environmental law. There's something called the polluter pays principle. Okay, we're creating. If you're worried about costs to your grandchildren and your children, you better wake up to this problem, because if a court gets a hold of what the U.S. has done in terms of raising greenhouse gas emissions, I and most lawyers think the U.S. is going to get on the hook for the damages. The damages could be astronomical. Think of Hurricane Sandy. It was $40 billion for one storm alone, okay? But that's a moral question as to whether, and under what factual basis should those that caused the problem be responsible for paying for it. That's an issue in the negotiations, and it has been for 20 years, but we're not talking about it. So we've lost 40 years. Okay. On the other side of that chart with the red line, where the opponents of climate change got organized during this 35-year period. So I'm going to talk about what sociologists call the climate change disinformation campaign. So for 40 years, particularly the fossil fuel companies, not all fossil fuel companies, but particularly Exxon and Peabody Coal and Chevron, have been funding opposition to climate change, and they've been responsible. The social sciences have now well documented who's funded it, what they did, what kind of arguments they made, and a little bit more about that. But we've lost 40 years. And the United States, Saudi Arabia and the United States have been the two biggest obstructionists in the climate negotiations since they started. Occasionally Australia, occasionally Canada, but for 20 years now, Obama has changed. For the first time, Obama has said he's going to do something about it. That's a big change. But what people do not know is what Obama said he will do, which is being strongly resisted, is not enough. It's not the U.S. fair share. So every year, the world gets together in what's called the Conference of the Parties. How many have heard about the Paris Agreement last year? Does that ring a bell? Okay, it should be on your radar. Everyone around the world was talking about it last year in December. The whole world, 192 countries came to Paris, and they signed an agreement in which every country in Paris agreed that this was a serious problem. Every country. That's a big change. particularly for some countries, particularly the OPEC countries. They've agreed that this is a serious problem, and they all brought commitments to this Paris meeting. The commitments are not nearly tough enough, but it's a start. But at a COP, this is called the Conference of the Parties, in the Cancun COP in 2010, the whole world agreed to try to limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade. Because the science says if we raise the Earth's temperature has been amazingly stable for 11,000 years. If 2 degrees centigrade doesn't seem a lot, but looking at the entire Earth, it is a lot because it melts the ice, it changes ocean circulation patterns, it creates more storms. So the whole world agreed that it would be colossally stupid to try not to limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade. And the reason for that is in those 2 colored bars. On the bottom you see numbers which represent temperatures. And the bottom bar it says large-scale discontinuities. What does that mean? Well, the climate, when it changes, if it gets out of the stable range, it doesn't change slowly in proportion to the amount of the greenhouse gases. In the climate system, there are not only, the climate doesn't respond like when you turn a dial on the stove. There are switches in the climate system that make rapid changes in system, the properties of the system. And there's about 10 of them that we know about. So you probably have heard of methane in the tundra in Russia. So there are stored greenhouse gases that we know that if the methane warms up, it will liberate this methane, and which will create not like a dial switch in temperature. It will be like a switch. There is a huge amount of methane stored in the Atlantic Ocean along the eastern seaboard. Okay, 55 million years ago, methane hydrate. The oceans got warm enough, and it liberated all the methane stored. And there was almost in a 20, 30 year period, there was a 4 or 5 degree centigrade change, a 4 degree centigrade change. So the reason why they agreed to 2 degrees centigrade is because the world is worried that we have, does anyone know how much warming we've already caused? Does anyone in the audience knows how much? Okay, but it's slightly over 1 degree centigrade since that beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But some of these switches can create in themselves 4 and 5 degrees centigrade rises in the system. So let me go back. So 186 countries agreed in Paris last year to do something about climate change. That's a positive step in this rather gloomy story that I'm unfolding. And they all presented what they would do. Now, they also said, because the science was starting to roll in, that 2 degrees centigrade is not good enough. Because we're starting to see these switches that we didn't think we would see until we saw 2 degrees centigrade. There's evidence that the methane is being liberated in the tundra. There's some evidence that ocean circulations that we didn't think we would see until above 2 degrees centigrade. This evidence is not 95% confidence, but there's a lot of evidence that the scientific community is really, really worrying that we're running out of time to prevent really, really dangerous climate change. So the whole world agreed, even the Saudis agreed in Paris to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's staggering. The implications for policy of trying to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade is a staggering, staggering challenge for the human race, and the press is not reporting on it. And I will explain why that is the case. So, and the reason why they moved the whole world, and even the Saudis agreed to move from a 2 degree warming target, which, by the way, would mean you have to stabilize carbon dioxide in the atmosphere about 450 parts per million, we're about 400 parts per million now, is because some of the positive switches we're starting to see. Sea level rise looks like it's rising faster than we thought. IPCC said, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said that we would have a 1 foot sea level rise. They now think with what we're starting to see, particularly with the West Antarctic ice sheet starting to melt, and parts of Greenland melting and the Arctic ice sheet melting, that we're probably, we're gonna have a 3 foot sea level rise, IPCC said, by 2100. Well, there are hundreds of millions of people, particularly in Southeast Asia, that live along the ocean. The world's biggest cities, like Shanghai, and are all ocean cities. And you have these people in the Pacific who all have to move. Now the evidence, the most recent evidence, that it may be more than 3 feet of sea level rise. IPCC said maybe 4, and there are some scientists think that 5 to 12 feet of sea level rise by 2100 is now feasible. Not proven, but feasible. So the reason they went from 2 to 1.5 is that the evidence is coming in that if anything, IPCC underestimated the responses of the climate system. Forests are starting to die back in droughts. That's a bad thing for climate change. And that's a bad thing because the forests absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. We depend upon them to remove carbon from the atmosphere. The Arctic sea ice is melting more rapidly. That's one of these switches. You hear a lot about the Arctic is melting, but a lot of people, many times when it's discussed, it's not talking about what the real scientific significance of it. The reason why it's a switch is because the ice, when it's white, it reflects incoming radiation to outer space. If the ice disappears, the oceans start to warm up even faster because it's not reflecting the incoming radiation into outer space. It's a bad thing for temperature if all the ice disappears. There's some evidence of melting permafrost, and there's some evidence that about half of the carbon emitted around the world, and everyone is emitting carbon when they're driving cars. Everyone around the world is emitting carbon dioxide through consumption of fossil fuels, and it's really increasing in poor countries dramatically at dramatic rates. So in that chart, you see the gray is where most of it's coming from, the fossil fuel, above the middle of the chart. So most of it's coming from fossil fuel combustion. The yellow is land use. Land use changes also. When you kill forests, the trees die off, it releases carbon, and they stop the sea. The bottom part of the chart is where only half of the carbon is getting into the atmosphere, which is represented by the light blue line. Half of the carbon is being absorbed through soils and vegetation. And the ocean has always absorbed. So only half of the carbon that we're now emitting is actually going into the atmosphere. But it's out of the atmosphere is where you want to keep the carbon from appearing because it raises the line in the bathtub. Well, there's a limitation on how much the oceans and the forests can absorb. At some point, they will be saturated. And there's incomplete evidence that some of both the oceans and the forests, at least the existing forests, you can always plant more trees and get more removal through, but the sinks are starting to act as if we may reach some sort of limit. What I'm telling you is this is viewed by the mainstream scientific institutions. This problem has never been articulated by the environmental groups. Environmental groups are capable of exaggerating problems. I've seen some that I can tell you about, I've experienced with. But this has been articulated by the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. The US Academies of Science, there are 19 of them around, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There's 120 scientific organizations that have high respect, that are usually organized around disciplines. They all support the consensus view. Okay, how could it be? If I'm telling you is true, how could it be you have 6 people running for president and say the whole thing is a hoax? How could that be? I'll tell you how it would be at the end of this. We know how that happened, and I'll explain it. Now, I don't mean to scare you. I'm a pretty optimistic person, and I will tell you there's some reason for optimism at the end of this, but this is not a happy story, okay? This is a civilization-challenging problem for the world. And what we need is a World War II kind of mobilization that everyone gets involved in reducing greenhouse gases. I think it's going to happen. People are starting to happen. We need you to work. If you believe what I'm saying is true, we need you to work on it. You need everyone to get to reduce greenhouse gases. We need a mobilization because the greenhouse gases we are emitting are not hurting us as bad. It's hundreds of poor people around the world. We're directly responsible for droughts and floods and misery and loss of water supplies, okay? You have a moral obligation to try to start to keep track of your carbon footprint. And I'm here to plead with you to become involved to try to make that mobilization happen. It will happen. I predict 30 years from now, it will all be in place. People won't be talking about it the same way. In parts of Europe, it's already starting to happen, and there's some reason for optimism. But before we go, let me tell you about the civilization challenging. This chart shows 4 dotted lines. The yellow dotted line on the right hand of that slope is where the emissions reductions pathway, that if the commitments that were made by the countries in Paris, what it would do for us, what would the pathway reduction. They only committed to 2030, so you have to extend that. So the yellow dotted line. The red dotted line is 2 degrees centigrade pathway. Notice the steepness one, the second one from the right, is to calculate the pathway, you have to figure out what the carbon budget is for different atmospheric concentrations. So the way that is calculated, it's actually the total number of tons that the world can emit to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade. The red dotted line is the 2 degrees centigrade emissions reduction pathway at a 50% probability that you'll limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade. And then the blue dotted line is 2 degrees centigrade at a 66% probability. And the green dotted line is the emissions reduction pathway for 1.5 degrees centigrade. Look at the steepness of the slope. Okay, you're talking, and it's not only the magnitude, as I'll explain, it's the speed that we got to do it. And people aren't talking about the speed, and I'll explain that. After Paris, IPCC said to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, the whole world must be carbon neutral in terms of not the agricultural sector, but in terms of the industry and transportation, electricity sector, has to be zero carbon between 2045 and 2050. That's staggering. That's requiring a change in infrastructure and technology unlike humans have never had to face. And that's for the whole world. That's not for the rich countries. The rich countries have to go faster because there's this problem of justice that I alluded to. Okay, so here is, on the right-hand side, the carbon budget for 206 for 2 degrees centigrade since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was about 790 gigatons. That's the gray part. To the right, the green part is how much we've already used of that 790, and the carbon budget that is left. Now, the budgets are somewhat controversial. You can calculate them slightly differently, but no matter how you do it, the order of magnitude is still in fact correct. So we have 275 gigatons if under this carbon budget, and the problem is who gets it? Okay. So should the United States get a proportional share? It's caused the problem. So the other thing people are not talking about is the speed at which we have to do this. It's not only the magnitude. There's much more discussion about the magnitude, but very little at the speed, because the carbon budget is disappearing. Every day you wait, the problem gets worse. We've lost 40 years because the fossil fuel companies have funded a disinformation campaign. I believe this is some kind of new crime against humanity. It's very, very ugly, okay? So here's roughly, and every country's target is a slice of the carbon budget, okay? So the question is, what is the US slice of the remaining carbon budget? You can't avoid that. If you take a position, you're taking a position on your fair share. That's not a problem you can answer with economic analysis. It's a question of distributive justice. And IPCC has said that. The chapter I worked on said that, okay? Economics reasoning doesn't deal with justice. It deals with efficiency or increasing the size of the pie. It can't by itself tell you how to think about justice. That's the field of ethics or justice, okay? So this is meant to show you, every day you wait, it gets worse. Okay? The pies are getting smaller, and if you don't do your fair share, if you don't take the slice of the pie, which is your fair share, someone else has got to step up to it, okay? Or you exceed the budget. Fairness is an incredibly important problem, which the United States has completely ignored in terms of the enormous amount of public discussion of this. What are you hearing? The press is talking about the same two old issues. There's no scientific uncertainty and it will cost jobs. That's all we're talking about. No one is talking about the fairness issues of this. We need you to talk about the justice issues. Americans aren't bad people, but they won't get the fairness issues unless someone talks about the fairness issues. And this shows you the carbon budgets are going to disappear. And here is another staggering, civilization-challenging effect of this. For a 1.5 degrees centigrade carbon budget that's left at current emissions, global emissions levels, which I believe are around 50 gigatons of carbon, we run out of the budget in 5.2 years. Okay? We're running rapidly out of the budget. We need speed, not only magnitude. Okay, we got to get everyone to work on this. Okay, for a 2 degrees centigrade rise, which we've already discovered is likely to cause a lot of problem, and only with a 66% probability, you run out of the budget at current global emissions levels in 20.3 years. And by the way, global emissions are not peaked yet. They're still going up. Okay, so when global emissions, when you figure out the carbon budget, you've got to figure out when global emissions peak, okay? This is an amazing problem of justice and morality, okay? So what I want you to do, or ask you to do, if you think what I'm saying is true, I want you to work with your friends and to get everybody to ramp up the response to climate change. And I'm going to make a couple of recommendations in particular. When you set a carbon budget, when you try to figure out what the US fair share or Pennsylvania fair share, Pennsylvania as a state is the third largest emitter as a state of any state. California and Texas are higher. But as a country, Pennsylvania ranks 19th as a country. There's a huge amounts of carbon coming from the state. And by the way, different governments have control over different things that emit greenhouse gas emissions. The state regulates some things the federal government does, so you've got to get all levels of government, the federal government, the state government, and your local municipal government to do greenhouse gas inventories and targets. I would argue we all have a moral obligation to get to do that, okay? So when you set a target, most people don't know how to set a target because you have to deal with these issues of budgets and temperature limits. That's not how we set targets before. You have to pick a budget, and there's some complicating factors about the budgets. There are different budgets with different probabilities. If you notice, the 2 degrees centigrade lines were for a 66% probability and a 50% probability. Well, the small-lying developing states, we want a 90%, a 95% probability. We're not going to exceed 2 degrees centigrade. But why is it 66 and 50%? Because there's almost no budget left for a 95% probability. It's too late to have high levels of probabilities for 2 degrees centigrade. So I'm going to move to the end of my step here. And you've got to do this based upon equity, okay? You have to, it's both morally required, it's legally required. The US agreed 40 years ago that our target would be based upon equity, not simply prevent dangerous climate change. But this shows you it's practically required. So this chart shows you a 2-degree emissions reduction pathway and where the China current target will take you. The US is at the bottom green, but if you notice, even if there's nothing left for the rest of the world. Okay, the big countries, if they don't radically increase their emissions reductions, there's nothing left for the rest of the world. So there's a lot of literature about what equity requires. It doesn't mean cost-benefit analysis. It could mean equal per capita shares to the environment. IPCC just did a whole chapter, which I worked on. What does equity mean? And it's a disputed term. Reasonable people can disagree on what distributive justice requires. But it doesn't mean that anything counts. And IPCC says that. You don't have to know what perfect justice requires to get everyone agrees on what injustice is, okay? So the way the Paris Agreement works is there's no enforcement target, but all the countries are supposed to come and explain what they did on equity. And so it's all going to depend upon shaming countries. And by the way, I have an amazing research project with the University of Auckland, New Zealand. We got 23 researchers in 23 countries to examine how this is being debated in 23 of the leading climate change. And what we discovered was not surprising, shocking, but not surprising. Countries are actually setting their targets not on what equity or a carbon budget would require of them. They're setting it in large part on national economic interest. We knew that did not surprise us. But what did surprise us and shock us is that the NGOs, the non-government, the activists, didn't know how to criticize their government based upon equity and stringency. So equity is practically required. People think you're going to talk about ethics. They think you're talking about pie in the sky stuff, that philosophers talk about in the closet with other philosophers. This is really practical applied justice. It has policy significance. You can't think about policy clearly until you get the ethics issues. I know of no other environmental problem that is the case. By the way, so thinking about what the US fair share, the whole world, as I said, should, even the Saudis agreed that the whole world's got to go to zero carbon in this century. If you take one of the equity characters is who's caused the problem, okay? One of the responses you'll get from opponents of climate change is we shouldn't have to do anything until China does the same thing that we did, and they'll say that China is the largest polluting nation. On the left-hand side, you see the red line is in terms of tons of emissions, China is actually a larger polluter, but we're far worse than China in terms of who caused the problem, okay? Historical emissions are relevant to this problem of distributive justice. And in fact, the person that did this chart, Jim Hansen, he says the United States has not only consumed its total equitable share, it's already consumed China's share, which is a fairly controversial thing to say. These are different equity criteria. The RAID, equity is a disputed term, but there are only 4 categories of things that the literature says should be equity. Okay, I'm going to end with this following topic. So I've just described to you my job. I tell all my students, don't believe what I say. It's your job to think about whether you believe what I say. My job is to tell you what I think, okay? It's your job to tell you what you think, okay? So I'm not asking any of you to accept everything I say. My job is to tell you what I think I know and what I think. But how did we, if half of what I said is correct, if the whole world agreed in Paris, the climate change is 196 countries agreed in Paris that this is a civilization challenging problem, how could it be that we're only talking about scientific uncertainty and costs to the US economy? Well, this is how it's happened. Sociologists, for the first time, the social sciences that have played a role in this have not been sociology. They've been largely economic theory who've tried to do efficiency calculations about how to solve it, and some psychology. Sociology, or how power has worked to structure the public's understanding of what the problem is the realm of sociology, not economics or psychology. The sociologists have really dug into what they call the climate change disinformation campaign. A disinformation campaign, so they call it they explain it, what happened, as a social phenomenon that happens for other human problems. When people with a lot of economic power are threatened by another social problem, the people whose money and power is threatened all throughout human history spontaneously organize to fight the people that are threatening them with their arguments. So the climate change disinformation campaign is actually one of a series of human phenomena that we are now seeing, which is organized and funded by people whose economic interests are threatened by another social movement. So that's how the sociologists explain how this happened. There are hundreds of peer-reviewed sociological papers that explain who funded it, what they said, and what they did. It was, this is what they did. They created think tanks and front groups, an AstroTurf group. An AstroTurf group is a group that they organize, and it pretends to be a fake bottom-up organization, so they send people to meetings and say, we're just normal citizens, but it's all been funded by the fossil fuel industry and the other people that have been funding this. They created websites and internet traffic on the disinformation campaign. There was recently a paper in the US Academy of Sciences Journal that masked how these people that are participants, how they've communicated with each other, and they identified 6 of 140 people that have been sending out the misinformation. And by the way, no one's in charge, but they talk to each other over the internet. So they're listening to each other. So one group can say, we've debunked the climate science, and the rest of them all pick it up and print it, okay? So that's how it works. It's a spontaneous, self-organized social phenomenon, all funded by people whose economic interests are threatened by climate change. So that's how it's happened. The funders were originally Peabody Coal in the early 1980s. There was an organization called Western Fuels, which was a coal organization. Then to Exxon in the mid-80s really got into it. It was followed by other fossil fuel companies. Most of them were in the game. Some of them have left the game, but it's still, in fact, going on. You may have seen publicity that people are trying to sue Exxon. Exxon is the dark angel in all of this, in my view. They have been completely irresponsible. They've been funding, they funded something called the Citizen Climate Lobby, which was all fossil fuel money. I went to some of their meetings. They were telling people things which were absolutely false, that there's no evidence of human causation, that climate change will be good for you, okay? And this is all fossil fuel money that did this. The next big funders were free market fundamentalist foundations, including Mellon, Bradley, Scaife, and Olin, okay? Now, what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, there's a guy, the sociologist at Drexel by the name of Brule, who's the expert on the funding. He says you can't track the money anymore because the people funding it all moved it into 501c4 corporations. You don't have to disclose who the funders are. So it's getting hard to figure out how much money. I believe this should be part of the conversation about climate change. It's not part of the conversation. This is some kind of new evil, I believe, because the tactics of, I've written about this quite a bit. Climate skepticism is a good thing. Skepticism is what makes science work. We should encourage more skepticism. But skepticism has to play by the rules of science. The rules of science say if you're going to say there's no evidence, you have to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. You have to subject your claims to peer-reviewed scrutiny. That's how science works. That's the truth check. These guys aren't publishing. They're holding fake conferences, and they're bringing people that have theories about climate change, and then they publish it in books and letters, and the think tanks are at the center of the disinformation campaign. There's a thing called the Heritage Foundation. There's about 20 of them. They're holding meetings and getting press, and they're generating an enormous amount of literature to attack the climate science. And by the way, whenever anything is about to happen, and politically they've ramped up their opposition and media. So they have PR campaigns. I want to tell you about the last one, cyberbullying. They've been cyberbullying the journalists and the scientists. People, a professor here worked at Penn State. Some of the Penn State professors have been terribly cyberbullied. I know a lot about cyberbullying because I've been pretty viciously cyberbullied myself. I wrote an article which wasn't trying to be a polemic, but I'm a lawyer. I was writing to other lawyers. What kind of crime is this? Okay. Before I get to that, let me tell you about one of the tactics is lying about the science or reckless disregard for the truth. You'll hear people say there's no evidence of human causation. That's not skepticism, that's a lie. I was at the microphone 20 years ago when every country in the world agreed. The lines of evidence, there's like 20 independent lines of evidence that it's human caused. There's something called fingerprints and attribution studies. And we know the carbon in the atmosphere is fossil carbon. It's not natural carbon because of the isotope. We knew 150 years ago, if you put in a molecule of carbon in the atmosphere, precisely how much warming initially, or what is called forcing, additional molecules of carbon in the atmosphere would cause. The question, there's been some uncertainty about how much warming when everything at balance, but most of the science has been really strong for a very, very long period of time. But you had people saying there's no evidence of human causation. That's not skepticism, that's outrageous lying or reckless disregard for the truth. Something this important, we should not tolerate that kind of, we need to have a conversation about, we want skepticism, we should not tolerate lies or misinformation. Exxon's trying to defend what it's did on grounds of free speech, okay, which is a whole nother interesting problem. These are the fingerprints of climate change. What normally, the factors that normally drive the Earth from ice age to warm periods, there are 4 Earth-Sun relationships. The way the Earth goes around the sun is not a circle, it's an oval. But the scientific community knows precisely in watts per square meter how these natural things drive the natural variability. But if the sun is causing the problem, because the greenhouse gases are midway up in the atmosphere, what is called the tropopause, it's like a blanket, the upper atmosphere, as more greenhouse gases gets colder, as the lower atmosphere gets warmer, okay? And lo and behold, that's what's happening. There are 10 fingerprints of that greenhouse gases, not natural variability, there are attribution studies. The fossil carbon is appearing more, the oxygen level is decreasing as as carbon dioxide increases the atmosphere. When I saw this evidence 20 years ago, I said, this is as certain as you get. That was 20 years ago, okay? But yet people are saying there is no evidence of human causation. So, so let me end now with a plea for you. If you feel moved by this, what you need to do. We need to get the U.S. to to really get going on this. And all hands on deck, World War II kind of mobilization. The U.S. has got to set a tougher target. The Obama target was a step forward, but it's not nearly strong enough. There's something called the Clean Power Plan, which is being litigated right now, which Obama is pushing. It's good, but it's not nearly strong enough, and no one knows that. We need to go to zero carbon. No matter how you do the equity calculation, the United States and Pennsylvania must go to zero carbon. Now here's the problem. People do not want to talk about this. Not only is the coal industry threatened by this, not only is the largest industry in the world, the petroleum industry, threatened by this, but now natural gas is threatened by this. Okay, the Pennsylvania legislature is currently run by any power by the natural gas industry because of all the fracking going and because it's created wealth and jobs in the state. The Pennsylvania legislature, Pennsylvania is doing virtually nothing. As a country, it's 19th. It has no target. It's tried to start a couple of things, but it is currently doing nothing. Okay, so we need people to organize both at the national level and at the state level and even at the local level. One sign of hope is there are cities all around the world that have really done really remarkable things. They're moving fast, and that's true in countries you would be surprised that this is starting to happen. In fact, a lot of people think at the city level is where you can really make a difference in terms of greenhouse gases, whether it's what electricity is supplied for, what the public transportation system looks like. So I don't mean to, let's see. And this is the part I say, don't slit your wrist yet, okay? There's a lot of hope out there too, okay? Every country in the world today, yesterday, agreed with the Paris Agreement. They ratified the Paris Agreement. 164 countries have renewable targets. China is pretty aggressive on renewable energy right now. Germany has already achieved 25% renewable energy. Costa Rica has 99%. EU's trying to get 20% renewables by 2020, just 4 years from now. So there is hope, but we need mobilization. I think we will solve this. The question is how much damage we're going to do before we solve it, as I see it. Thanks. I'll take questions.